Somewhere in the American Midwest, there is a piece of land so vast it takes over an hour to drive across it. And it belongs to one man, not a government, not a corporation with 10,000 shareholders. One man. Somewhere in Australia, a single private cattle station covers more land than the entire country of Belgium. 17 million acres of territory that feeds a nation and then some. In Brazil, a farming operation is so enormous that its annual harvest could fill every grain silo in France twice over. Most people think farming is what small families do. They picture a red barn, a tractor, maybe a few hundred acres passed down through generations. They think of farmers as the working class of the land, honest, hardworking, but never wealthy. Not truly wealthy. They are looking at the surface. Beneath the surface, hidden inside holding companies, shell structures, family trusts, and sovereign-level land titles, lies one of the most concentrated and most invisible accumulations of private wealth on Earth. The richest farmer in the world doesn't wear overalls. He doesn't wake up at dawn to tend his fields. He wakes up in a penthouse, or on a private jet, or in one of several estates spread across multiple continents. And while he sleeps, his land prints money. This is the story of how farmland became the ultimate asset of the ultra-wealthy, and how one man's agricultural empire became so large, so powerful, and so deliberately hidden that most of the world has no idea it even exists. We are tracking the most powerful land empire on Earth, one built not on technology, not on finance, not on oil, but on soil. We are going to uncover how a single individual came to own more farmland than most sovereign nations control. How that land quietly generates hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. And why the global food system, the thing that literally keeps humanity alive, is increasingly controlled by a handful of billionaires you've probably never thought twice about. Wait until you hear about the specific moment one man's team began quietly buying up American farmland, state by state, county by county, so discreetly that local farmers didn't realize what was happening until it was already done. By the end of this video, you will understand why the richest farmer in the world is not a farmer at all, and why that distinction matters more today than at any other point in human history. The land is being bought, the food supply is being consolidated, and the man at the center of it all has been hiding in plain sight. Let's go. To understand how one man came to own more American farmland than any other individual in history, you have to go back, not to a farm, but to a garage. Not a farm in the Midwest, not a ranch in Texas, a garage in Seattle, Washington. The year is 1975. Bill Gates is 19 years old. He has just dropped out of Harvard University, one of the most prestigious institutions on the planet, to chase a vision that most people at the time thought was borderline delusional. That one day, every home in America would have a personal computer. His parents were horrified. His peers were skeptical. The world was not ready. But Gates was not thinking about computers forever. He was thinking about systems, about infrastructure, about the kinds of assets that don't just grow in value. They become indispensable. And decades later, after building Microsoft into a $3 trillion empire, after accumulating a personal fortune that at its peak exceeded $130 billion, Bill Gates made a move that almost nobody saw coming. He started buying farms. Not one or two. Not a hobby ranch in Montana. He started buying farmland the way Microsoft once bought software companies. Methodically, aggressively, and at a scale that defied comprehension. The purchases began quietly in the early 2000s, routed through a land management company called Cascade Investment, LLC, Gates's private investment vehicle, operated out of Kirkland, Washington. The transactions were deliberately fragmented. Different parcels, different states, different holding entities. It was structured specifically to avoid drawing attention, and it worked. For years, almost nobody noticed. By the time investigative journalists and agricultural watchdogs began connecting the dots in 2021, Gates had already accumulated over 269,000 acres of American farmland, spread across 18 states, including Louisiana, Arkansas, Nebraska, Arizona, Washington, and Michigan. That figure has since been revised upward by multiple analysts tracking land registry filings. To put that number in perspective, 269,000 acres is larger than the entire landmass of Hong Kong. It's roughly the size of Los Angeles County. It is more private farmland than any individual has ever owned in the recorded history of the United States. But here's what makes this origin story truly extraordinary. Gates didn't just stumble into farmland as a vanity investment. He was advised, he was strategic, and the people whispering in his ear understood something that most of Wall Street hadn't yet figured out: that in a world of infinite digital assets, finite physical land was about to become the most valuable thing on the planet. The origin of this empire wasn't a field. It was a thesis. A cold, calculated, billion-dollar thesis about the future of food. And once you understand that thesis, everything else about this story starts to make a terrifying kind of sense. The purchases didn't happen overnight. This empire was assembled the way a chess grandmaster builds a winning position, quietly, patiently, and always several moves ahead of everyone else. In the early 2000s, Cascade Investment LLC began making its first significant land acquisitions. The initial targets weren't random. Gates' team focused specifically on prime agricultural land, soil rated Class 1 and Class 2 by the USDA, meaning the most fertile, most productive, most irreplaceable farmland in the country. They weren't buying scrubland or speculative desert acreage. They were buying the best: Louisiana Delta farmland, Nebraska Corn Belt territory, Pacific Northwest potato growing land in Washington state. Each purchase was carefully routed through layers of LLCs and holding entities, names like Red River Trust, Angelina Agriculture, and Cottonwood Ag Management, all ultimately tracing back to Cascade Investment. It was a legal, deliberate, and extraordinarily effective strategy for acquiring land below the radar of public scrutiny. The first major inflection point came around 2012 to 2014 when Gates dramatically accelerated his acquisitions. This wasn't coincidence. It aligned almost perfectly with a period when farmland values were surging, driven by rising global food demand, ethanol mandates, and a flood of institutional capital entering agriculture. While other investors were just waking up to the opportunity, Gates was already 2 decades ahead. By 2014, Cascade Investment had quietly become one of the largest private landholders in multiple states. Local county records showed parcel after parcel being absorbed, sometimes entire townships worth of productive agricultural land changing hands with minimal public notice. Then came the deals that truly defined the empire's scale. In 2017, Gates' team completed the acquisition of approximately 100,000 acres in Louisiana, a single transaction so large it restructured the agricultural land ownership map of the entire state. The land, primarily used for growing soybeans, corn, and cotton, generates estimated annual revenues in the tens of millions of dollars through lease arrangements with working farm operators. But Gates wasn't operating alone in this space. He was part of a broader, seismic shift in who owns American farmland. Ted Turner, the media mogul behind CNN, had already assembled nearly 2 million acres of land across the American West, making him the second largest private landowner in the United States. The Emerson family of California, owners of Sierra Pacific Industries, control over 2.4 million acres of timberland and agricultural territory. The Singleton family and the Irving family of Canada quietly dominate agricultural land corridors that span entire provinces. And then there is the global picture. In Australia, the largest private landholding is the Kidman and Co. Empire, once covering over 10 million acres, which was controversially sold to a joint venture including Gina Rinehart, Australia's richest person, and Chinese investment groups in 2016 for approximately 386 million Australian dollars. The political shockwaves from that single transaction changed Australian foreign investment law. In Brazil, agricultural conglomerates like SLC Agricola farm over 600,000 hectares of Cerrado savanna, land that was jungle 30 years ago and is now among the most productive soybean and cotton territory on Earth, feeding supply chains that reach every continent. The rise of the farmland empire is not just one man's story. It is a coordinated, global repositioning of wealth, from volatile digital assets and fluctuating stock portfolios into something ancient, something permanent, something that every human being on Earth cannot live without: food. Every single year, the global population grows by approximately 80 million people. Every single year, the amount of arable land on Earth either stays the same or shrinks, eroded by climate change, urban sprawl, and soil degradation. The math is not complicated, and the people who understood that math earliest bought the land first. Bill Gates understood it earlier than almost anyone, and what he built on the back of that understanding is an empire so deeply embedded in the American food system that most people interact with it every single day without ever knowing his name is attached to the soil beneath the crops. But the acquisitions, the LLCs, The strategic land grabs, that's just the foundation. What sits on top of that foundation is where this story gets truly staggering. Let's take inventory, because when you lay it all out, side by side, state by state, continent by continent, the full picture of this agricultural empire is genuinely difficult to process. Bill Gates currently controls, through Cascade Investment LLC and its network of subsidiary entities, an estimated 269,000 acres of American farmland across 18 states. That number, staggering as it is, represents only the confirmed holdings. The parcels successfully traced through public land registry filings by investigative outlets including the Land Report and the National Young Farmers Coalition. The actual total, according to multiple agricultural economists, is likely higher. The crops grown on Gates-controlled land include soybeans, corn, cotton, carrots, and potatoes. In Washington state alone, his farmland produces a significant portion of the potatoes used by McDonald's for their French fries, meaning that every time you pull up to a drive-through window and order fries, there is a measurable statistical probability that the potato in your hand was grown on land owned by the world's most famous software billionaire. Let that sit for a moment. But the farmland is only one layer of the empire. Gates's agricultural holdings operate in concert with a series of strategic investments that essentially allow him to profit from every stage of the food production chain. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the largest private charitable foundation on Earth, with an endowment exceeding $70 billion, Gates has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into agricultural technology companies, seed research, and fertilizer development across sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Critics argue this positions the foundation not merely as a philanthropic actor, but as a market-shaping force in global agriculture, one that influences which crops get grown, which seeds get used, and which farming methods become dominant across entire developing economies. Then there is Breakthrough Energy Ventures, Gates's climate-focused investment fund, which holds significant stakes in companies developing synthetic fertilizers, vertical farming technology, and lab-grown protein. In other words, Gates is simultaneously invested in traditional farmland and in the technologies designed to replace traditional farming. He profits from the present system, and he is positioned to profit from whatever replaces it. The total agricultural and food system adjacent investment portfolio, controlled directly or indirectly by Gates and Cascade Investment, is estimated by financial analysts to exceed $1 billion in deployed capital, with annual returns from farmland leasing alone estimated between $50 million and $100 million per year. Now zoom out. Globally, the concentration of agricultural land ownership has reached levels not seen since the feudal era. The top 1% of farm operations in the United States control over 70% of all farmland value. In Brazil, 1% of landowners control nearly 45% of all agricultural land. In Australia, a handful of families and sovereign wealth funds effectively determine the grazing and cropping capacity of an entire continent. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, is one of the largest private landowners in the United States, controlling an estimated 1 million acres of agricultural and ranch land through its for-profit subsidiary, AgReserves Inc., generating revenues that flow directly back into church coffers. Their Deseret Ranches operation in Florida alone covers 290,000 acres, making it one of the largest cattle operations east of the Mississippi River. The Ryman family of Germany, heirs to the JAB Holding Company fortune, built on consumer goods brands including Keurig, Panera Bread, and Pret a Manger, have quietly assembled agricultural landholdings across Europe and South America that rarely appear in mainstream financial reporting. And sitting above all of them, in terms of sheer territorial dominance, are the sovereign wealth funds. Saudi Arabia's government, facing domestic water scarcity, has been systematically purchasing and leasing farmland across Africa, Asia, and the United States to secure food production for its own population. A strategy called land grabbing by critics and food security investment by its architects. The empire of agricultural wealth is not one man's story. It is a global apparatus, but Bill Gates remains its most visible and most controversial face. And the way he actually lives, day to day, while this machine quietly runs beneath the surface of the global food system, is something that almost nobody talks about. There is a property sitting on the eastern shore of Lake Washington in Medina, Washington. It has been under near constant construction, renovation, and expansion for over 3 decades. It spans approximately 66,000 square feet. It has a 60-foot indoor swimming pool with an underwater music system. It has a trampoline room with a ceiling high enough to accommodate full aerial flips. It has a 1,500 square foot reception hall, a 20-car garage, and a private library that houses a first edition copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Codex Leicester, a manuscript Gates purchased at auction in 1994 for $30.8 million, making it the most expensive book ever sold at the time. The property is called Xanadu 2.0. Its estimated current value is $131 million, and it is just one of several residences Bill Gates maintains across the globe. There is a $43 million oceanfront compound in Del Mar, California, a coastal enclave north of San Diego, where average home prices routinely exceed $5 million. There is an $18 million equestrian estate in Wellington, Florida, purchased in connection with his daughter, Jennifer Gates's professional show jumping career, a sport where a single competition horse can cost upward of $10 million. There are additional properties in Europe and reported holdings in resort communities that rarely surface in public financial disclosures. The private aviation infrastructure alone is extraordinary. Gates operates a Bombardier BD-700 Global Express private jet, a long-range aircraft with a list price of approximately $70 million, capable of flying non-stop from Seattle to Tokyo without refueling. He has been documented as one of the highest private jet users among American billionaires, logging hundreds of flight hours annually. In 2019 alone, his private jet reportedly emitted over 1,600 tons of CO2, approximately 59 times the average American's annual carbon footprint. The irony is not subtle. The man most publicly associated with solving climate change through clean energy investment is, by most measurable metrics, one of its most prolific individual contributors. His art collection, maintained across his various residences, includes works by Winslow Homer, Leonardo da Vinci manuscripts, and a rotating inventory of pieces whose total estimated value exceeds $150 million. His personal library, beyond the Da Vinci Codex, is legendary among bibliophiles, housing thousands of rare and first edition texts across history, science, and philosophy. The social world Gates inhabits operates at a frequency entirely removed from ordinary life. Annual attendance at the Allen & Company Sun Valley Conference, the so-called Summer Camp for Billionaires, held every July in Sun Valley, Idaho, places him in the same room as the CEOs of every major media company, the heads of sovereign wealth funds, sitting heads of state, and the architects of global financial policy. Decisions made in the informal dinner conversations of that conference have reshaped entire industries. His children, Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe, were educated at Lakeside School in Seattle, the same elite private institution Gates himself attended, before moving on to universities, including Stanford and the University of Chicago. Jennifer's wedding in January 2022 was held on the family's 124-acre equestrian estate in North Salem, New York, a property valued at approximately $16 million, and was described by attendees as a multi-day affair of extraordinary scale and intimacy. This is a lifestyle so insulated, so precisely engineered for comfort and privacy, that it barely registers against the backdrop of the empire generating it. The farmland, the investments, the foundation, they run themselves. They compound quietly, and the man at the center lives in a kind of sovereign tranquility that only the truly dynastic wealthy ever achieve. But the lifestyle is the easy part to see. What you cannot see, what requires real digging, is the network of influence, political power, and systemic control that makes this empire truly untouchable. In 2021, something unusual happened. A reporter from the Land Report, a niche agricultural publication that tracks private land ownership across the United States, published a piece confirming that Bill Gates had become the single largest private farmland owner in America. The story was picked up by mainstream outlets. It went viral, and for approximately 72 hours, it dominated financial news cycles. Then it quietly disappeared. No congressional hearings, no regulatory investigations, no serious policy response. The story evaporated, absorbed into the endless churn of the news cycle, and the acquisitions continued. That disappearance was not an accident. The political infrastructure surrounding Gates's agricultural empire is as carefully constructed as the land empire itself. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gates has contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to institutions, think tanks, media organizations, and policy bodies that shape the global conversation around food, agriculture, and land use. The foundation has given over $250 million to media organizations worldwide, including grants to NPR, the BBC, The Guardian, and dozens of smaller outlets, creating a web of financial relationships that critics argue generates a structural reluctance to publish adversarial coverage. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented pattern, one that agricultural journalist Tim Schwab meticulously outlined in a 2020 investigation for Columbia Journalism Review, which found that news organizations receiving Gates Foundation funding rarely, if ever, produced critical coverage of Gates-aligned initiatives. The Foundation's influence over global agricultural policy is even more direct. Through partnerships with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Bank, and the African Union, Gates-funded initiatives have shaped crop subsidy structures, seed patent frameworks, and fertilizer distribution networks across dozens of developing nations. Programs like the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, known as AGRA, have been simultaneously praised as life-saving interventions and criticized by African agricultural scholars as vehicles for embedding Western seed and chemical company dependencies into subsistence farming economies. The Rockefeller Foundation, Gates's ideological predecessor in global agricultural intervention, pioneered exactly this model during the Green Revolution of the 1960s, when American-backed agricultural programs reshaped farming across Mexico, India, and the Philippines in ways that dramatically increased yields, but also created long-term dependencies on patented seed varieties and synthetic inputs. Gates has studied that playbook carefully. On the domestic political front, Cascade Investment LLC and associated entities have deployed significant lobbying resources, though the precise figures are deliberately obscured through the layered corporate structures Gates employs. What is documented is that Gates maintains close relationships with agriculture committee members in both the House and Senate, and that the Gates Foundation has funded research directly cited in multiple pieces of federal agricultural legislation. Then there is the land itself as a geopolitical instrument. When Nebraska, North Dakota, and several other states began introducing legislation in 2021 and 2022 to restrict foreign and institutional ownership of American farmland, driven partly by concerns about Chinese sovereign wealth fund acquisitions, the bills were carefully worded to exempt existing large domestic holders. Critics pointed out that these carve-outs effectively protected the Gates portfolio while appearing to address public concerns about foreign land ownership. The political architecture was elegant, almost invisible, and at the center of it all sits a man who presents himself to the world as a philanthropist, a technocrat devoted to solving humanity's greatest challenges. The public image is of a bespectacled, sweater-wearing former software engineer who reads books and worries about pandemics. The private reality is of an architect of systems, agricultural, political, financial, whose reach into the infrastructure of global food production is so deep, so wide, and so deliberately constructed that unwinding it would require an act of political will that no government has yet shown any appetite to exercise. The question that serious agricultural economists are beginning to ask, quietly, carefully, in the language of academic papers rather than headlines, is this: when a single private individual controls this much of the world's food-producing land, and this much of the policy apparatus surrounding it, where exactly does philanthropy end and sovereignty begin? That question does not yet have an answer, but the next generation is already preparing to inherit it. In 2021, Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates finalized their divorce after 27 years of marriage, one of the most consequential separations in the history of private wealth. The division of assets, conducted through a series of private agreements that have never been fully disclosed to the public, transferred significant portions of the Gates fortune into separate trusts and holding structures. Melinda French Gates resigned from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2024, walking away with an estimated $12.5 billion in settlement assets to pursue her own philanthropic agenda. The divorce did not shrink the empire. It restructured it. Gates's 3 children, Jennifer, Rory, and Phoebe, have each been deliberately positioned at a careful distance from the operational machinery of their father's wealth. Gates has said publicly on multiple occasions that he does not intend to leave the majority of his fortune to his children, that each will receive what he has described as a minuscule amount relative to the total estate, with the bulk flowing into the foundation and philanthropic vehicles upon his death. But wealth at this scale does not simply disappear because of stated intention. The structures already in place, the land trusts, the Cascade Investment Holdings, the Foundation's endowment, the strategic equity positions across dozens of companies, are self-perpetuating machines. They generate returns, they compound, they employ armies of lawyers, estate planners, and financial architects whose entire professional purpose is to ensure that the capital survives, grows, and remains protected across generations, regardless of what any individual says at a press conference. Jennifer Gates has already demonstrated the family's instinct for land and legacy. Her equestrian career has driven the acquisition of multiple high-value agricultural and estate properties. Her husband, Nail Nassar, an Egyptian-American professional show jumper who competed in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, brings with him a family background in Egyptian real estate and development that adds another layer of international asset complexity to the next generation's portfolio. Rory Gates, the only son, has maintained an extraordinarily private profile. Almost no public presence, no documented interviews, no social media footprint of significance. In the world of dynastic wealth, that kind of deliberate invisibility is not accidental. It is cultivated, it is protective, and it usually signals that the most significant transfer of operational control happens quietly, behind the walls of family offices and trust structures, long before it ever becomes a matter of public record. The broader legacy of this agricultural empire extends far beyond one family's balance sheet. What Gates has demonstrated and what the global billionaire class has watched, studied, and begun to replicate is that farmland is the ultimate store of value in an uncertain world. It is finite, it is productive, it is essential. It cannot be hacked, inflated away, or made obsolete by technological disruption. In a century defined by the volatility of everything else, soil endures. The institutional capital that has followed Gates into agricultural land, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, private equity firms, family offices from Zurich to Singapore, has fundamentally altered the economics of farming in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Young farmers in the United States today face average land prices that have increased by over 300% since the year 2000. The dream of owning the land you farm, the foundational promise of American agricultural identity, is becoming statistically inaccessible to the generation it was meant to serve. That is the shadow side of this legacy. Not malicious, not conspiratorial, but real and growing. In 50 years, historians may look back at this period, the early decades of the 21st century, as the moment when the ownership of the Earth's food-producing surface quietly and irrevocably concentrated into fewer hands than at any point since the age of monarchs and feudal lords. The richest farmer in the world does not farm. He owns. And in the gap between those two words, between the labor of producing food and the power of owning the land it grows on, lies one of the defining economic stories of our time. So the question this video leaves you with is not about Bill Gates. It is about something much larger than any one man. If the land that feeds humanity is increasingly owned by the people who need it least, what does that mean for the billions of people who need it most? Think about that the next time you sit down to eat.